We are going to begin by reading an excerpt from chapter 11. That is the adulthood chapter of our forthcoming book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. There are 13 chapters in this book, so we are coming up on the end of these excerpts, which means we're also coming up on publication date, which is just 2.5 weeks away at this point, September 14th. Types of reality. Remember Wile E. Coyote, whose life's work was chasing the Roadrunner in Looney Tunes cartoons? In hot pursuit, he often found himself skidding off the edge of a cliff where he would hang, suspended in air, until he looked down. Gravity did not apply until he recognized that it should. It was funny because it was ludicrous. It was utterly ludicrous, and yet too many modern people seem to imagine that by changing people's opinions or perspectives, you change underlying reality. In short, they believe that reality itself is a social construct. We argued earlier that con artists and the confused often operate on a wholly social plane rather than on an analytical one. How do you avoid becoming someone who assesses the world based on social responses rather than based on analysis? One of those people who are easily fooled by con artists and the confused. Two good strategies are to regularly engage with the physical world and to understand the value of close calls. The sad truth is that the more educated you are today, the harder this is to do. Our current higher education system is steeped in a philosophy that doubts our ability to even perceive the physical world. That philosophy is called postmodernism. Postmodernists have been at the leading edge of promoting the view that reality is socially constructed. Postmodernism and its ideological child, post-structuralism, were once contained in a small corner of the academy. These ideologies do contain kernels of truth. They teach us, for instance, that our sensory apparatus biases us, and that we are mostly unaware of those biases. They reveal that school, factories, and prisons are similar in their use of power to control populations. That was an analysis done by Michel Foucault in his metaphorical extension of Bentham's Panopticon. And critical race theory has at its foundation the real observation that the American legal system has had a particularly difficult time emerging from its racist past, and that full recovery from that past is not yet on the horizon. These are a few real and valuable contributions that such ideologies have contributed to the world. But most modern instantiations of postmodernism have jumped the shark. Sometimes when fringe academic ideas go rogue, they persist longer than they might, but their impact is limited to a few university departments. Not so with postmodernism and its downstream effects. What happens on campus has most definitely not stayed on campus. Postmodernism and its adherents have infiltrated systems far beyond higher ed, from the tech sector to K-12 schools to the media, and are doing considerable harm. One of the most astounding conclusions of some postmodernists is that all of reality is socially constructed. They have even taken issue with the conclusions of Newton and Einstein, on the basis that the privilege of these scientists is obvious in their equations, and as old white guys, their biases inherently prevented them from knowing anything real of the world. People of particular phenotypes, this ironically biologically deterministic and regressive worldview argues, can't possibly have access to truth. How do you come to be this confused, though, to believe that all reality is socially constructed? Have little experience in the real world. No carpenter or electrician could believe that all of reality is socially constructed. No forklift operator or sailor could. Nor would have thought could any athlete. There are physical ramifications of physical actions, and everyone operating in the physical world knows this. If you have not thrown or caught many balls, or used hand tools, or laid tile, or driven stick shift, in short, if you have little or no experience with the effects of your actions in the physical world, and therefore have not had occasion to see the reactions they produce, then you will be more prone to believing in a wholly subjective universe, in which every opinion is equally valid. Every opinion is not equally valid, and some outcomes don't change just because you want them to. Social outcomes may change if you argue or throw a fit. Physical outcomes will not. Everyone, no matter how trapped they are in their body with its particular flaws and strengths, has the opportunity to experience the world of actions and reactions in the physical world. Not everyone can bike single track, but for those of us who can and do, we face objective reality in the form of roots, hills, and gravity. How, given your particular body, might you force your mind and body into confrontation with physical reality? Consider this. Our eyes do not produce a static image like a photograph. Rather, our eyes are tools of our brains taking note of the world. We are fully embodied. Our bodies are not afterthoughts to our brains or unnecessary to their interpretation of the world. Those eyes and those skulls on those necks, atop those torsos and legs and feet that move, it is all part of perception. Perception is an action. The more you move, therefore, within whatever your particular limits are, the more integrated, whole, and accurate your perception of the world is likely to be. Movement increases wisdom. So too does exposure to diverse views, experiences, and places. We need both freedom of expression and freedom to explore, because both speak to the value of environments in which outcomes are uncertain. Nature is still available to us. Let us spend time in it, and in so doing generate strength and calibrate our understanding of our own significance. Humans are evolved to be anti-fragile. We grow stronger with exposure to manageable risks, with the pushing of boundaries, fostering openness to serendipity and to that which we do not yet know. This is true for both bones and brains. Doing things with non-negotiable outcomes in the physical world, skateboarding, growing vegetables, ascending a peak, provides a corrective to many wrong-headed ideas currently passing for sophisticated. Some of these include all of reality is a social construct, emotional pain is equivalent to physical pain, and life is or can be made perfectly safe. A graduate school mentor of ours, George Estabrook, who was primarily a mathematical ecologist, but who also spent many years of field seasons working and living with the practitioners of a traditional agricultural system in the hills of Portugal, wrote this in the introduction to one of his papers, quote, "It is remarkable how the persistent empiricism of human beings, struggling to make their living in nature, results in practices that make ecological sense, even though they may be codified in ritual or explained in ways that seem superficial or not compelling ecologically. Indeed, local practitioners may have concepts, equally justifiable but very different from those of academics, of what constitutes a useful explanation." End quote. If we were forced to choose between the useful explanation given to us by a villager versus one provided by your average academic about an object that the villager depended on for her sustenance, we would surely choose the villager's explanation. Here we reference part of the introduction that we haven't yet shared with you guys. That Costa Rican villager who likely saved our lives by keeping us out of a rapidly rising river, whom we talked about in the introduction, knew far more about where we were and how to interpret the signs than we budding academics did. You can fool a person, and they can fool you, but you can't fool a tree or a tractor, a circuit or a surfboard. So seek out physical reality, not just social experience. Pursue feedback from the vast universe that exists beyond other human beings. Watch your reactions when the feedback comes in. The more time you spend pitting your intellect against realities that cannot be coerced with manipulation or sweet talk, the less likely you are to blame others for your own errors. That's the excerpt for today.
Yes. It is interesting how events proceeding apace since we completed the book seem to reflect well on many of the things that we described as generalities in there. There's just so much of the modern circumstance that is reflective of exactly these kinds of delusions and
So once
and
again,
errors.
the first draft was submitted in March of 2020, just as COVID was beginning to descend on the planet.
Right. So I am inspired to add one thing that is not contained in that that excerpt.
Yeah, this should be a living document.
It is ancient that people should have the sense that their desire for something to be true, if they can only put enough will behind it, affects the truth of what is correct, and that obviously isn't so. What we are seeing now involves a sort of second tier. Now, no doubt this has ancient origins as well, but there is not only the attempt to force reality to bend to one's desires, but we are seeing an industrial strength campaign now to shift the measurement of what has taken place so that it will reflect well on the belief that one can force something to be by willing it to be.
Yeah.
And this is it's a very dangerous kind of transition, because the problem is, in order to get better, we have to see the error of our ways. If the record of what took place is altered so that it reflects well on the myopia and blind spots of those who arrogantly pushed us in the direction of a policy, then we aren't in a position to correct our trajectory. And actually, many things are happening at once, obviously, in the world. What's taking place in Afghanistan, I think, reveals the full depth of the hubris of this system of governance, right? That apparently
You're talking about the system of governance that we are engaged in, or that they were engaged in?
No.
Yeah.
Our system of governance led us obviously into a situation we fought for almost a generation, and the gains, whatever they might have been, are reversed within hours or days. That suggests that whatever stories we were telling ourselves were not grounded in reality. In this,
Well, at least they weren't stable, or they needed more work to become stable.
well, let's put it this way. Presumably,
I mean,
the
women's and girls' lives were improved over the last 20 years in Afghanistan, and that is disappearing.
right, but we
For
were
instance.
not those of us in the society that launched into this campaign were not told that what we were doing was temporarily staving off
Right.
an evil that would descend again as soon as we left, right? We were led to believe that we were accomplishing something, and then we were led to believe that it was stable. And the opposite has turned out to be true. So I have no doubt that it was better to exist in Afghanistan under our temporary rule. But the point is, there was nothing accomplished. It was a matter of treading water, at least if this is the way that we left. So in any case,
Yes, certainly given the way that we left, it's a disaster.
and I think there's a general question here, which is, to the extent that something takes control and decides to mislead us into pleasant fictions about what our power in the world might be, what we might accomplish, what it will cost, all of these things, at the point that we finally get our comeuppance, it is an extremely rude awakening. And the question is, how much better off would we be if we had a system that made an attempt, at least, to be honest with us in real time about what the actual costs of something are, what might actually be accomplished, what are the real risks of doing this?
Well, just as compulsory schooling was in part explicitly intended in its origins in Germany, and to a large part we inherited those intentions when compulsory schooling took hold in sort of around the turn of the last century, was to create a populace that was easily controlled. That, as populations grew and as industrialization and mechanization grew, it was valuable to employers to have a workforce that didn't ask too many questions. And I have not heard it argued explicitly that it is valuable to a government that proclaims its democratic intentions in both its founding texts and in its current politicians, that it is valuable to have a populace that is underinformed, and yet that is clearly implicit in the policies and the ways that policies are handed down, and the kinds of proclamations like #FollowTheScience, except we're not going to tell you anything but the conclusions that unnamed experts behind closed doors have arrived at. That's not following the science, that's following the authorities, and that's not scientific.
Right. And the implication is that the authorities actually have a better vantage point, and that their interests are synonymous enough with ours that what they tell us is at least a good shot at what is liable to be the right direction. And the very frightening problem is that once you establish this relationship, that experts will decide something, you won't be able to check it or even understand who they are or what motivates them, but it's supposed to be in your interest, it will inevitably be captured. And what is fed to you as the truth as seen by experts will be propaganda. And the problem is that you are endangered by the very fact that there is an engine of propaganda empowered to dress up like experts and tell you what it thinks.
Yeah.
And that's where we are. And so
it's wearing the couture of science without being science.
It is the couture of science. It is cargo cult science, as Feynman would put it and did put it. And the problem is, yes, it's all well and good to describe it as cargo cult science, but the real point is, what is the danger of such a thing? And the danger of such a thing is proportional to the seriousness of the matters that are being navigated by this pseudoscientific process. And so, I don't want to draw the connection too closely, but I do think that to the extent that there is anything positive to be derived from the Afghanistan situation at all, it is the recognition that the system that was capable of making errors this big is in charge of many other things in which you are not in a position to see it unfold on your screen. And so the question is, all right, that thing was certainly so radically incompetent that it could not possibly be entrusted with anything important, right? It obviously, and I am not regarding what took place in Afghanistan as anything but of the utmost importance, but the point is, that was important. That was clearly lives on the line, and the fate of a people on the line.
Yeah.
And we see how well it played out. We can see, the hubris unfolding in graphic terms. But the question is, what also looks like that is not so visible or so easy to monitor? And many things are of great importance at the moment. We are navigating many uncharted waters, and I don't see any evidence that there's a great deal more competence than what was in charge in Afghanistan, in charge of, for example, COVID policy. And so, people need to think about that. It's at least a question. What if the thing that made this error is also making errors with respect to COVID that are equally as terrifying?
At the end of most of the chapters in this book, we have something called the corrective lens, in which we provide actionable suggestions that follow from some of the analysis and stories that we provided in the rest of the chapter. This one, the corrective lens items on this chapter are long. I was considering reading all of them, but I think I won't read all of them. But there are a couple that are particularly salient, I think, given the conversation we just had. The first one is explicitly aim to be an adult. Do this in part by regularly asking yourself the questions that we pose at the beginning of the chapter. For instance, am I taking responsibility for my own actions? Am I being closed-minded? And by minimizing the effects of economic markets on your daily life. Become aware of the constant flow of information telling you what to think, how to feel, and how to act. Do not let it into your mind. Do not let it steer you. Your internal reward structure needs to be independent and ungameable. That independence, in turn, should allow you to collaborate well with others who are similarly independent. Be wary of those who may well be nice, but who are captured. There's a lot. I think these are all good. We wrote them. 4 more. Smile at people. The people with whom you live, the person behind the counter, the stranger on the street. Put your phone down. No, really, put it down. Define your fights for whom and what you love, rather than against whom and what you hate. If a mob ever comes for people you know, people whom you consider friends, stand up and say, no, you're wrong. Be honorable and courageous when bullies move in. Speak up for what you know to be true, even if it makes you a social pariah. And finally, apropos the discussion of diminishing returns curves, which we don't have a picture of here, but we do in the final chapter of the book, learn to jump curves. Diminishing returns are a factor for every complex phenomenon, so learn to jump curves. Put another way, consider learning a new thing rather than being a perfectionist and trying to get ever better at whatever you are already really, really good at.